thank you all so much for coming along this evening to our session where we're going to be looking at planning and assessment in your first term on the training programme. Thank you to everyone as well who's just joining. So before we get started, I thought we'd just go around and do a couple of introductions before I run through what we're going to cover today, and then we'll just get straight into things. So I'm sure there are quite a few of you on this call who know me already. For those of you who don't, my name's Isabel. I'm an early talent officer here at Teach First. I currently look after some of our London trainees who are going to be starting the training programme in September. I did the Teach First training programme myself back in 2014, so quite a while ago now. I was then an English teacher in London. I taught at quite a few different schools across the city, and I joined Teach First last year. I'm joined by two of my colleagues on the call as well, who are also Teach First ambassadors. So I'm just going to pass to each of them so they can introduce themselves. Firstly, Leo, I will pass over to you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name's Leo Wax, and apologies. I work at Teach First as an early talent officer. Very similar to Isabel, I look after trainees in our London region. I did the programme back in 2015 and taught modern foreign languages I did the programme in Yorkshire, in Bradford, and then taught in a school in East London. Have worked in Teach First in two different roles, so as an early talent officer, but also I used to work directly on the programme as a development lead. And yes, that's everything about me. I'll pass over to Rob.
Thanks very much, Leo. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name's Rob Glover, and I'm an early talent manager here at Teach First. So I support members of the team like Leo and Isabel to recruit you guys onto the programme and to support you in starting the programme. I'm also, as Isabel said, an ambassador of the programme. So I took part, or was part of the 2016 cohort. And when I did the programme, I did primary on the programme in Sheffield. And after I completed the programme, I actually moved up to secondary school and taught history as well. So have sort of dabbled in both primary and secondary. Since then, I've worked at a university and then moved over to Teach First, where I currently am, and I've been here for nearly 3 years now. It's lovely to meet you all and looking forward to the session. Back to you as well.
Thanks so much, Rob. And Rob and Leo are going to be popping up throughout the session as well. So for anyone who's just joined, we just very briefly did some introductions and we're just going to get straight into the session. So to start off with, I'm just going to run through what we are going to cover today. And I also want to just kind of include a little bit of a disclaimer, because obviously this session is on planning and assessment, which is something that you will be learning about and covering in depth at Summer Institute in June. This session is very much just an introduction, giving you a little bit of an insight. So you may well come away from this session with kind of more questions than answers. So don't worry if there are kind of things where you feel like you've only touched on it quite lightly, but there will hopefully be a number of techniques that you come away from this session with that are useful and kind of give you a little bit of food for thought between now and when you start Summer Institute. So what we'll start with, initially we're just going to kind of gather a few thoughts about some questions that you might have about planning. Then we are going to just run through some common mistakes in planning and assessment that anyone who's training to be a teacher will come across, and just give you a bit of a heads up as to what you might experience. We're going to be looking at two techniques from a book called Teach Like a Champion. Some of you may have heard of this before. It's by someone called Doug Lemov. Anyone who kind of has been in schools, or Rob and Leo will know this very well. It's kind of something that is used quite extensively by teachers at lots of stages in their career. So we're going to look at two techniques that will help you with planning. We're also going to do a planning activity as well. So we're going to kind of get to put some of that into practice. You're going to be able to have a little bit of a go yourself. And then we're going to finish up with a Q&A as well, because as we said, me, Leo and Rob are all ambassadors. We've all completed the training programme, so we know that there'll probably be quite a lot of questions that you will have by the end. So before we get into actually starting you kind of off with some techniques and looking at some planning, we thought we'd just begin with some questions that you might have, because it's likely that you're coming into this session with a lot of questions about lesson planning. I'm going to ask you to kind of narrow that down to one question that you might have about lesson planning. This might not be kind of specific to your subject, it might be more general. If you just scan the QR code that's on the screen now, it will take you through to Menti, and it gives you an opportunity to just pop in a question that you might have about planning. I'll just leave the QR code up for 30 seconds, a minute or so you can scan that. And then in a moment, I'm going to switch over to Leo, and he's just going to kind of run through some of the questions that are coming up and give us a bit of an insight into which of those questions we might be covering in today's session, but also some of those ones that you might be going into more depth on when we get to Summer Institute. So I will just leave the QR code up there for a little bit longer.
Wow, we've got a lot of questions already. And just to say, if these are questions that haven't, if you weren't able to think of any, that's absolutely fine as well. I can definitely relate to that. When I came into the program, I didn't really know what I did and didn't know. So there's no kind of right or wrong with this. But let's have a little look at the ones that have come through. So does every lesson need an in-depth plan? Does it have to be written formally? How long? Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. How long should it take to lesson plan? Will we have any help? You absolutely will have help. How long should you spend? It's a $1 million question. What kind of features do we need to cover in a lesson plan? What's the best way to structure a lesson? There's so many good questions. I'm very impressed with the questions, actually. Isabel, I don't know whether you're able to scroll to some of the other ones, maybe. But these are really, really good questions. Before I just look at a few more of them, I'll just say as well, we definitely won't answer all of these today. But what it is nice to see is that, you know, it sounds like you're all really switched on, you're all really thinking about things and want to do the best job. Like Isabel said, we're just going to kind of look at the real nuts and bolts of what it might look like to plan a lesson. You know, as some like kind of general kind of statements, you're definitely going to have help. And just that one before, actually, you won't necessarily be writing a formal lesson plan for every single lesson you do. We'll have Q&A time at the end, and we can fire through lots of these, but you know, you're not going to be like writing a page lesson plan for every single one you do. Is there a set structure that should be followed? Some people, you know, I used to follow a set structure, definitely, for each one. But that, you know, departments sometimes have a structure, sometimes schools have structures, so it really varies. How long does it take is a common theme that's coming out here, which we'll talk about, and sort of how that will potentially change over time. Hopefully it will change over time. How much freedom do we have in lesson planning? How much dictated by the school/government? Yeah, really, we're not really going to necessarily look at the kind of that side of things today. We're going to look more about the mechanisms, but that's a really good one for you to think about moving into the process for sure. I'm just going to see if there's any last ones before I hand back to Isabel, but it sounds like we've got such an engaged audience this evening. Would how you plan a lesson vary depending on the year group? I most certainly think it would. How far in advance do we plan? You know, it depends on the teacher for sure, but we're going to talk about it now. I'm going to hand back over to Isabel, because I think this session is going to give you a lot of answers, but it might also leave you with some more questions, which is absolutely fine. But I'll hand back over to Isabel now.
Thanks, Leo. Yeah, and kind of looking through those questions, there are a lot of them that we will touch on in this session. And I think a lot of those are kind of the most common things that we tend to kind of think about, you know, when we're planning every single lesson. A lot of those will crop up, you know, from day to day, week to week. But as Leo said as well, there are some that we won't be able to cover today, but a lot of those will be covered during Summer Institute for sure. So I'm just going to go back to our PowerPoint and reshare that so we can get started. Okay. So what we're going to start off with is, as I kind of mentioned, we're going to have a think about, before we actually get into a couple of things that will possibly kind of prevent some of these mistakes from happening. It's quite good to kind of share things that give you a little bit of a heads up that, as you probably will know, lesson planning is something that can be challenging. It's really exciting and really enjoyable, and really allows you to kind of be creative and inventive. But particularly when you start, there are many, many things that will go wrong. And this is the case for every single trainee, and kind of getting comfortable with knowing that you will make mistakes, but also that the mistakes are really useful because you can learn from them, is, a really good place to start, actually. So I've put kind of here, these are common lesson planning mistakes and pitfalls that will happen to you. It's true, they will, not all of them. I also put an exclamation mark because this is something that you shouldn't really be worrying about, and this is the type of thing that when you make these mistakes, your mentor, your development lead, will be expecting you to make them. They will not be a surprise, but also they are there to support you with all of those. Some of these mistakes and things that happen you'll be able to rectify very quickly. Some of them will be kind of a much longer term process, over the course of weeks, terms, etc., etc. So one thing that quite commonly happens is what we call over planning. So you're kind of really going into lots of extensive detail about different activities and different elements of your lesson, but actually it's not something you can always fit in to one lesson for so many reasons. You might end up spending much longer on one activity than another. There's, when you're particularly getting to know your classes as well, in those first few days and weeks, you're getting to know, their attitudes, how long they might spend on certain activities, what they find really easy, what they struggle with. So over planning is something that you will likely do at the beginning, but it's something you'll be able to kind of work on and rectify as time goes on. Not planning for or adapting to the needs and ability of your students. And this is a mistake that teachers make, even quite far into their career. Again, when you're getting to know your classes, before you know those students really well, you might create activities that are pitched kind of too high for the ability of your class. You might not kind of make those adaptations for students that might have additional needs. This is something that you will get better at very quickly as you get to know your classes really well. But it is something that you will all experience and will all go through. Reliance on resources and then technology fails you. This is something that has happened to every teacher in any school where there is kind of, any sort of technology that you're using. We all rely on, a really amazing worksheet that we've used. We've got a really exciting video to show the students in the lesson where lots of things hinge around it, and then the internet is down, or the video doesn't load, or the printer isn't working. Now, we're not saying that you need to have an amazing backup plan for every single lesson that you plan, but just kind of an awareness of this, that it might happen, because when it does happen, you will have to think on your feet and use that initiative and that resilience that you need to have as a Teach First trainee. This is something that we probably won't be touching on in a huge amount of detail in today's session, but it's something that you will be really working on in depth and being innovative and creative about ways to check for understanding when you are teaching your students. Because you can begin your amazing lesson with your really exciting first activity, but if you don't actually plan those opportunities to check that your students understand that activity, then that can make the rest of the lesson a lot more difficult. So as I said, we'll be touching on this today, not in a huge amount of detail, but just something that as you are in your first few weeks and your first half term of teaching, you will get really, really familiar with looking for those opportunities, creating those opportunities, and becoming more and more successful with them. Not reflecting on past teaching and feedback. Now, you've all had an experience of reflecting on your prior teaching in the Development Centre for Teach First when you did your teaching episodes. This can be one of the most useful things when you're planning lessons, knowing what didn't work, adapting your planning. There can be a tendency to think, oh, I'm just going to keep going with this technique or this activity and hopefully it will work. Not being able to reflect is where you start to kind of make those pitfalls tend to happen. So just kind of being really aware, and your mentor and your development lead will really encourage that reflection as well with the feedback that they're giving you. And finally, planning a lesson chronologically from the beginning to the end, rather than using the learning objective as a starting point. So, obviously we know that a lesson will be a series of activities. When it comes to planning, if you are starting to plan your lesson and you think the first thing you're thinking about is the very first activity that students will do, that can actually kind of make it more challenging for you in terms of planning your lesson and in terms of the students engaging with it. So we're going to kind of use that last common mistake in as kind of a starting point to have a think about. So I would like you to think, why might planning a lesson from beginning to end, so kind of chronologically, so the first thing that you're going to be planning is the first activity that students are doing. I'd like you to just have a think about why this might not be the best approach. And if you can pop any ideas that you have in the chat, Leo is then going to have a look at some of those ideas going into the chat and just kind of share some of the thoughts before we move on.
I can see someone's just asked about clarifying the question, which we absolutely can. So what we're kind of asking is, when you approach your lesson planning, if you were to plan it and think about going chronological order. So first of all, I will do this, then I will do this, then I will do that. And we're trying to think about why we think this is not the best approach. I hope that clarifies. I'm just gonna have a look through some of the answers. Yeah, a good one from Jessica about wasting too much time to start a lesson. If you don't have that kind of endpoint in your head, you might end up not really getting to the goal. You haven't checked what the students already know. Really good one there. That's all to do with, what are the starting points? Do I need to go over anything before I start teaching them something new? It's a rigid structure that doesn't allow students to contribute to the lesson. Yeah, and it doesn't take into account lots of different things. You want to get clear what exactly you want students to learn this and then work backwards from that. Yes, very good answer, Ali. Very good indeed. That's very much, I think, the crux of it. Timing never goes to plan. Yeah, it's all about that adaptability for sure. I'm just going to scroll down. See if there's any others. We've got lots of great ideas coming through. I think the one from Shayna, if you're diverting from the main objectives outcomes, yes, that's absolutely true. And if you plan from beginning to end, you might dilute what the main kind of objective of that lesson is. For sure. I think we've done a lot of really good ideas here. So and it seems like we've really got the point. So I'll leave it to you, Isabel, to continue. Oh, that's nice. I like that one that just came through. Eat the meat instead of pinpoint the bones first. Not so vegetarian friendly, sadly. I'll hand back over to you, Isabel.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it, actually. And yeah, as Leo said, lots of really great points there, a lot of which are kind of hitting on, the real crux of this question. So we're going to be looking at a couple of techniques, kind of starting off with looking at this idea of not necessarily planning a lesson from beginning to end, so planning with the first activity through to the second, the third, etc. And these two techniques are going to be from, as I mentioned, this book, which is called Teach Like a Champion. So it's now in its third edition. And this is from Doug Lemov, who is a kind of really experienced practitioner. And a lot of his techniques that feature in this book, they are not all related to planning. He also has a lot of techniques related to things like behavior management, checking for understanding. But we're going to look at two of his techniques that are really helpful in terms of planning. And if you are still kind of a little bit unsure in terms of that question that we just posed and some of the answers that were coming through, we've got a really kind of excellent quote from him that really kind of goes towards kind of explaining what we mean by this. So one of his key techniques, which is incredibly useful when it comes to planning a lesson, is known as begin with the end. So in relation to this is something that he said is kind of really important to keep in mind when you are planning. He says, when I started teaching, I would ask myself while I planned, what am I going to do tomorrow? The flaw was that I was thinking about an activity for my classes on the following day, not an objective, what I wanted my students to know or be able to do by the end of the lesson. It's far better to start the other way around and begin with the end, the objective. So here, and so this is what some of you touched on in your answers in the chat, we're starting to think about what is the objective? What will my students be able to do by the time they leave my lesson? Rather than thinking, okay, what's the first activity I want my students to do? We're beginning with the end, the objective, what they're going to be able to leave the classroom, having learned about, what skill they're going to have be able to hone, etc., etc. So we're going to kind of put this in just a little bit more concrete terms rather than abstract. So as I said, we're always thinking about, what do I want my students to learn by the end of the lesson? Or as one of my mentors used to put it when I was training, by the time your students leave your classroom, what are they able to do that they weren't able to do before? So the way that we approach this is by, first of all, kind of setting the objective. And you'll probably be very familiar with the idea of kind of learning objectives or lesson objectives. Those two phrases are kind of used interchangeably. And yeah, initially you're going to be thinking, what will my pupils be able to do by the end of a lesson? Now, as I said, this might be learning and using a completely new skill or technique. It might be kind of honing something, but you're thinking about, by the time they leave my classroom, what will they be able to do that they couldn't do before? The next thing you'll be doing is deciding the assessment. Now, just in terms of clarifying what we mean by assessment, um, assessment quite often brings to mind this idea of like an end of term assessment or an end of year assessment, like an exam. That absolutely can be assessment, but what a lot of the time we're talking about in teaching, when we're talking about assessing learning, is we are assessing whether students are understanding, we're assessing what they are learning throughout the lesson. How will I be able to assess what my students are learning as we move through and progress? So after you've kind of decided what will my pupils be able to do by the end of the lesson, you need to think, okay, well, how can I know if they can actually do this? How am I going to be able to assess whether or not they can do this particular thing? Once you have then figured that out, it then allows you to start to plan your activities for a lesson. So you can start to think about, what activities can my pupils participate in to develop their understanding? Now, again, we've made this a little bit more concrete, but to make it kind of even more concrete, we're just going to use an actual example, just a very kind of skeleton outline for how this might work with an actual lesson. So we're going to start off just by thinking like an example from a maths lesson. So we've got there are 3 different stages. In terms of setting an objective for this particular lesson, it's for students to be able to divide fractions. So this is the thing that the students need to be able to do by the time they leave the classroom. So for deciding the assessment, this is where the teacher is thinking about, how am I going to be able to know that a student has met this objective and they've learned how to divide fractions? So the assessment will be, students are able to explain to a peer the process of dividing fractions. So if they can do this, I know that they will have achieved the objective. The activity then means that you can plan an activity which will allow the students to be able to demonstrate this within the lesson. So then we've got an example here. Students are able to identify which answers an imaginary pupil has answered incorrectly. So as you can see, we are not, with this particular lesson, we're not starting with what's the first activity students are going to do when they walk in the room. That would be planning chronologically. Here, we're starting with the objective, the last thing, the end, what they're going to be able to do when they leave the classroom. And here, that is where our process starts, and that's how we take it through. If you are kind of looking at this process and you're still a little bit unsure and you're not quite sure how everything connects, that is absolutely fine. We are going to kind of go through it again with another example where I'm really showing you how we would kind of build this and put this into an actual lesson plan. So if you're now starting to think, oh, okay, I see, I'm starting to connect the dots, brilliant. If you're still a little bit unsure, that is absolutely fine. And hopefully the activities we're going to go through in a moment will start to answer some of those questions. So before we get into kind of showing you how this actually works in practice, where you're actually starting to plan a lesson, quite a few of the questions that we got a little bit earlier were kind of alluding to, what kind of support will you get with planning lessons? Where do you even start? What kind of will your school provide for you? And very often, and this does very much vary from school to school, department to department, you'll be provided with something that is called a scheme of learning. Now, a scheme of learning is something that outlines the learning that a class will undertake, usually for that kind of half term or possibly for a whole term. Now, schemes of learning are something that is created by the school, by the department. They're often adapted every year. And this is something that everyone in the department will have access to help you plan your lessons. Now, as I said, schemes of learning vary a lot from school to school, from subject to subject. I'm going to show you very briefly what a scheme of learning might look like, just so you've got an idea of what you can expect to be given when you go to your employment school and you start to engage in your lesson planning. Now, first of all, I'm going to start off with a scheme of learning that is on the more detailed side. So this is a scheme of learning from the most recent school that I worked with. So as I mentioned, I was an English teacher. This is just an extract from a scheme of learning for Year 11 classes. Now, as you can see, there's quite a lot of detail in this scheme of learning. We've got on the left-hand column, there is the week and the date of when particular lessons are going to be taught. You've been provided with specific lesson objectives for that week, so you know what the learning objectives will be for your lessons. We've also got in here for this scheme of learning activities. We've got lots of specific ideas for what you can actually include and put in your lesson. And also on this scheme of learning as well, there's some ideas of homework tasks that you can set. Now, this is just an extract, as I said. This scheme of learning was quite extensive, as you can see. So this is the type of thing that you could be provided with. So here, you're not creating your learning objectives yourself. Your head of department will be telling you exactly what you need to be teaching your students from lesson to lesson each week. Now, as I said, this scheme of learning is on the much more detailed side. You could get a scheme of learning that looks a little bit more like this, something a little bit simpler. So you can see from this scheme of learning, this is for Year 9 for the spring term when they were learning about Shakespeare. Here we've got an indication of, for the whole unit, some key objectives, some key knowledge and terminology, an idea of the assessment at the end, and a couple of guidelines for planning. So kind of quite a wide overview. Now, if you look down at the lessons below that, so kind of in the second half of the page, there's a lot less detail. We've got your learning objectives, and you've also got some assessment objectives, which is something you'll learn about when you kind of learn a little bit more detail about exam boards and what your students will be working towards. But this is something where actually you have a lot more freedom around the sort of activities you want to include in your lesson. Again, these are only 2 examples of schemes of learning. Some schools might provide you with a set of PowerPoint slides where you can adapt those for your lessons. Some of them might provide you with something that's slightly different, but this is just a reassurance that you will not be going into a school with told to teach a particular text, a particular topic, and you're doing everything from scratch. You will get something that looks a little bit like this. As I said, varies from subject to subject as well, but you'll have an idea of what your learning objectives will be. So you're being provided with that starting point for what you're going to be doing for your lessons. So next, I'm just going to take you through, now that you've got a lesson objective or you know what the focus of one particular lesson might be, what we actually do with that and how we go about this concept of kind of beginning with the end. So this example that I'm going to give you is, again, it's going to be English because I'm an English teacher. I'm aware that you'll be from a lot of different subjects. The subject is specific, but the process and the technique and the lesson planning is the same. So even if, English was your least favorite subject and you're very much not going to be teaching English on the training program, this technique will still be pretty useful in terms of how you'd actually go about building a lesson plan from an objective. After you've done that, Leo is then going to take you through another technique as well before you get to have a little go yourself. So we're going to start off with just one lesson objective from when I was teaching Key Stage 3 English. And this is a real lesson objective, and this is from a real lesson that I planned. This is when I was teaching Year 8 and we did a unit which was called Blitz Grammar. So it was actually aligned with what they were learning in history as well. So it was focusing on learning about the Blitz, but also it's kind of testing their grammar skills. So the learning objective for this lesson was to be able to use compound sentences effectively in descriptive writing or creative writing. Now, this little template here is what I've used kind of over the years throughout my teaching when I've been planning a lesson. Now, obviously, as you can see, it's got the little arrows on it in terms of the order in which these activities will go. So this is the order in which students will go through the activities. So they'll start off with a starter activity. It will then be kind of activated in terms of the main skills or topic that they're going to be exploring. We'll then go through to the main activity, which is where they really kind of get into the real meat of what they're studying. And then it will finish up with a plenary consolidating their learning. So that is chronologically how students will experience the lesson. But with our planning, as we've discussed, we don't start with the first activity students will be doing when they come in the classroom. We get to the point where we think, okay, this is my learning objective. How am I going to know if a student has met this objective? So the first thing that I'm thinking about is, okay, if my student need to be able to use compound sentences effectively in descriptive writing, how am I going to know if they've done that? And the way that I'm going to know if they're able to use compound sentences effectively is if they can write me an extended piece of writing. So my main activity for this lesson was to write a 1 to 2 paragraph description inspired by an image of the Blitz using compound sentences correctly. By students producing this, this allows me to be able to assess whether or not they've met the learning objective and whether or not they can use compound sentences effectively. So I've got kind of the main crux of the lesson, but I now need to think, okay, how am I going to get to that point? Because I can't just have my students come into a lesson and say, this is what you're going to do. You're going to write me 2 paragraphs, and then I'm going to figure out if you are able to use compound sentences correctly. I'm then going to think, okay, how am I going to get to that point from the beginning of the lesson? So I then started to think about my starter activity. So I wanted to really kind of have something engaging to get them into, if they're doing a piece of creative writing, I really wanted to get them into that environment. So I started off with a soundscape with lots of kind of sounds and elements from the Blitz. And I also wanted them to recap a little bit of prior knowledge in terms of simple sentences, which we'd learned about previously. After that, we've got them recapping the prior knowledge. They're kind of immersed in what they're going to be writing about. We then need to get to the point which is going to get them ready to do the main activity. So they're going to be turning simple sentences into compound sentences by using a conjunction. We then get to our main activity. And then finally, we're going to consolidate it with some peer assessment. So they're going to be checking each other's work, and they'll have a success criteria so they're able to work out whether or not their partner has done this activity correctly. So as you can see, we've kind of started off with our learning objective. We figured out what the assessment is going to be, what they're going to be able to do, which is going to allow me to figure out whether or not they've actually done this. Then it's allowed me to think about how am I going to get them to that point. Again, there may be some of you who are now watching this thinking, oh, okay, this makes sense. I completely kind of see why we started at the end and come back to the beginning. There might be some of you who are thinking, this is seeming kind of, I'm not quite fully understanding how we've got to that point. Again, that is absolutely fine. You're going to be able to have a little bit of a go yourself a little bit later, but also this is very much just an introduction, and you'll be covering this in a lot more depth by the time you get to Summer Institute. So that is one of our techniques that we can use for lesson planning, and one possible template that you can use. I'm now going to pass over in a moment to Leo, who's going to take you through another planning technique, which is something that you might find more useful than this technique. And it's, again, another technique from Doug Lamolt's Teach Like a Champion. And this one is called double planning. So I'm going to pass over to Leo, and he's going to take you through this.
Thank you. Sorry, Isabel and myself are in the Teach First office, and the automatic lights have just turned off, the movement activated one. So if we look a little darker, that's why. The other thing I just wanted to flag was just because I know someone said schemes of work and schemes of learning the same thing, and just I would say potentially be prepared for different schools calling things different things. Between Isabel, Rob, and myself, we've probably heard so many different names for very similar things. So don't get intimidated by that, because you'll quickly figure out what's what. So yes, I'm going to talk about double planning. So double planning is a kind of a technique that you will probably be introduced to when you first start the program. The idea behind double planning is that when you are teaching, you have a lot to think about. You're trying to guide, 30 students potentially through a variety of different tasks to get them to learn things, and you need to be doing lots of things yourself during that time. So double planning is a way to really kind of start to understand I guess, what you're going to be doing, where you're going to be in the room, etc. Does anyone, if you can, think of any other benefits of using this technique, this double planning? What might be the benefits? So you're thinking about what you're the teacher going to be doing, but what the students are going to be doing as well. Great idea from Andrea about freeing up that working memory so you can really engage. You'll be in control, absolutely. Yeah, keeping on track on time, on topic, fantastic. Yeah, so I think everyone's really on the right kind of like got the sense of what this is good for. Really good ideas coming through actually. Putting yourself in their shoes, I really like that one as well, because if you start to think about what they're going to experience for the whole lesson, you might think, oh, they've had a lot of like independent writing stuff, they need something, you know, that bit like something verbal, or, you know, etc. So Isabel, if you can move on to the next slide. And yes, so I've got an MFL example here, so modern foreign languages. I used to be a Spanish teacher. I'm French actually. So with this one, then disclaimer, this is, you know, very basic, but I hope it will demonstrate this idea of double planning. So the learning objective here is to learn the colours in Spanish. That's probably not the best learning objective upon reflection, but could be more specific, but we'll go with it. So for that starter activity, a word search with those Spanish colours in, so you're introducing that. Whilst the students are completing that word search, I will be circulating, I'll be praising the ones that are completing the task, I'll be settling in late students. So already thinking of those different things that I need to be doing whilst they're just kind of getting on. Next one, introduce those colours, go through pronunciation, choral repetition, which is basically I say it, they repeat it, and following but with a game to like practice using those new words that I've just introduced them to. So they're then listening to me, they're facing the front, and I'm actually doing the presenting, guiding them through that. Then I'm going to get them to do a reading comprehension. So they're actually in silence at this point. And again, I'm circulating. I'm going to be supporting students. There might be some struggling students that need my kind of like bespoke one-to-one support. And then for that plenary, for that final task, I'm going to be getting them to write something for me that gets them to demonstrate what they've learned today using those colours. And again, I'll be ensuring that that task gets completed, giving some praise. And there might be some people that struggled in the previous task, so they might actually need a different task. They might be one step behind, so I might on the spot need to adapt that and think what can they do to put something into place. And yeah, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of what double planning might look like. Again, very much dipping your toe in, intro to this. You're going to learn lots more about it, but that's something to think about. I'll hand back over to Isabel.
Amazing. Thank you, Leo. And yeah, as Leo just said, you know, you might at this point be thinking, oh my God, here's 2 brand new lesson templates and learning objectives. I don't quite understand what a learning objective is. There's so much information that I'm just taking in at this point. That's absolutely fine. But we're just, giving you a bit of an insight into 2 just really useful ways to go about lesson planning, and something that might not have occurred to you yet at this point when you're thinking about planning your lessons. So what we're going to do, kind of now that we've taken a look at those 2 techniques from Teach Like a Champion, we're going to have a little bit of a chance for you to have a go at doing a little bit of lesson planning yourself and move on to time for an activity. Now, this is, in terms of the time that we have, this is just going to be a little bit of a chance for you to have a go at something yourself for now. We're not expecting you to finish this at any point, but it's something you can start, have a go at now, and also something you can take away and have a bit of a go at in your own time. So what I'm going to be doing once I've run through what the activity is going to be, is putting in the chat a couple of resources, a link to several resources that you can use. I'm going to be giving you a list of learning objectives for a variety of different subjects, so all subjects that you might be teaching on the training programme. And from that list, you're going to choose a learning objective, or you could create your own if you want to. You're then going to use that learning objective as your starting point to plan the activities for a lesson. I say a whole lesson, you might only get to the point where you figure out your main activity and maybe the hook. That's absolutely fine. You might just be figuring out the main activity and that's it. Again, also fine. And what we're going to suggest you do is you choose one of those lesson planning templates to help you plan. So I'm also going to give you a copy of the planning template that I used for my English lesson, and also the double planning one that Leo used as well. And you can, as you are doing this, you can have the opportunity to pop any questions in the chat. We can't promise we will be brilliant in terms of any subject specific questions, because obviously we're quite little bit more limited in that sense, but any general planning questions we can absolutely kind of give some guidance on. So what I'm going to do in just a moment, and you will have to bear with me for maybe 30 seconds whilst I get the links, is put in the chat a link to the learning objectives and also the lesson planning templates. We're going to give you around 10 minutes just to kind of make a start and have a go, which will give us still a bit of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm just going to pop those in the chat, so if you bear with me just for a moment. Okay. And just copying and about to paste. Get ready. Okay. And that'll come out in an absolutely enormous font, but never mind. At least we're all going to be able to see it easily. Okay. I think my Teams is now very excited by having so many people in this call. It's taking forever to send the links through. There we go. There we go. Okay. So you've got two links there. One is going to take you to the learning objectives. So you can either choose a learning objective from that sheet, or if you want to create your own one, that's absolutely fine. The second link will take you through to just a blank version of those two lesson planning templates. So as I said, we're going to take about 10 minutes. It's very much kind of what you feel comfortable having a go at in that time. So as I said, if it's just picking a learning objective and figuring out what the main activity of the lesson is going to be, do that. If you've got loads of ideas for double planning, have a go at that as well. If you've got any issues, technical issues, if you can't open anything, or if you've got any questions that you'd like us to answer, then just pop them in the chat. And then, yeah, we'll come back in around 10 minutes or so. Okay, everyone. So I know that we're all probably at very different stages in that activity, which is absolutely fine. But I know that, as I said, a lot of you have lots of questions, possibly far more questions at this point than you did when you started this session. So we're going to finish up with a little bit of a Q&A. I know we've got a lot of questions in the chat already. If you have any other questions at this point, then feel free to pop them in. And Rob is just going to moderate a couple of questions, and we're going to share a little bit of insight on some of the questions that you've got. So Rob, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Isabel. Yeah, I can see we've had lots of good questions throughout the session, and obviously time won't allow us to answer all of them, but please do fire them through and we'll try and get through as many as we can. If we can't get through to them today, I won't lie, we won't be able to follow up with them sort of later on this evening. But what we can try and do is, well, what we'll say is that SI will cover them for you, absolutely, because SI does a fantastic job of preparing you for the program. So as I said to Jessica's question there that came through, we'll cover that one first. So regarding planning, would you ever plan for behavioural management if it's for a particularly challenging class, for example, and you know it will realistically limit actual learning time? I'm happy to kick us off here, and if Leo and Isabel want to jump in, they can do. But what I would say on this question, Jessica, is this might sound like a bit of a rubbish answer, but what I would say is every lesson plan you make, in theory, is planning for behavioural management, because a lot of behaviour, or sort of, when you might be thinking about misbehavior, if you like, in a lesson, more often than not, it will come from perhaps lack of engagement with an activity, or it might come from boredom, or it might come from the activity or setting being too high ability so they can't access it, or too low an ability so they're finding it boring. So what I would say with this one is, really, if you're planning a lesson well, you're sort of already planning for behavior management anyway, because you'll be avoiding any issues that come through. However, obviously your question is referring to a particularly challenging class, perhaps, that regardless of what you do, you might have some issues. You perhaps can plan it into your lesson, and perhaps thinking about alternative ways of engaging that class. So potentially thinking about the different resources, the different types of activity you might do for that class for a particular child, perhaps who you know isn't going to engage with the same activity as other people. So you might factor that sort of thing in. The other thing I'll say as well is when you start these lessons, when you're developing your teacher-pupil relationship, and your lessons might take longer in terms of you might have delays while you're stopping and waiting for people to be quiet, and you should sort of factor that in and just be aware as well that you might have this lesson plan at the start of the year that takes longer to get through, but by the end of the year, when that relationship is set and there's that consistency, you'll be able to get through more in a lesson as well. Isabel or Leo, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it very well.
Thank you ever so much. So I'll move on to the next question. I know Leo answered it like that, which, to be fair, he covered it pretty much bang on in terms of how long should you spend on a do now task. Yeah, typically sort of about 5 to 10 minutes in a typical 1 hour lesson. The only thing I was going to add with the do now task as well is they're a fantastic opportunity to sort of encourage your students to come in and just take ownership of their own learning as well. Something I used to do with my do now tasks was have 3 options in terms of ability as well. So I taught in primary, and I love Star Wars, so mine were all based on like different droids meant different ability levels, so they could choose to do the R2-D2 task, the C-3PO task, or the Yoda task. Sorry, throwing in a non-droid there. The Yoda task was sort of that master level, so if they felt confident, they could go for that one. They only had to choose one of the 3; they didn't have to do all 3. And then there was a challenge section underneath. So a do now task is a fantastic opportunity to, in that 5 to 10 minutes, give people ownership of their learning straight away as well, and let them sort of set the pace for their own lesson, if you like. Okay, so I'm just scrolling down now while I've been talking. Have we had any more questions come through while I've been doing that? So what's a do now task? Leo's covered that one for me, thank you. So I struggled to come with an idea for main activity. Is there anything that you used to come up with to figure this out easier? I think, Leon, in terms of your question there about struggling for main activities, what I would suggest is just to reiterate that you're not on your own, and not to forget that, you've still got the whole of Summer Institute to go. And also once you start in schools, you're going to have other teachers that can support you. You're going to have other teachers that can share ideas with you. Sometimes you'll even find you might have main activities already planned for you because they've done the lessons in previous years. And then your job as a teacher is to adapt that to your current class. So don't worry too much if you're sat here thinking, I'm struggling to think of any main activities. To be honest, I wasn't very creative with thinking main activities, and I used to lean on other people a lot to support with that. So don't worry, it will come more naturally as you do more, for sure. So what does plenary mean here as well? So nice quick question. The plenary is sort of at the end of the lesson, which essentially is a way of summarizing what people have learned. You can use them in different ways. I used to use them quite a lot as a sort of final activity to a quick fire activity perhaps for students to prove to me they've learned what the objective was and factored that in. Sorry, Isabel and Leo, I appreciate I'm just firing through here. Anything you'd add to any of those that I've gone through at the minute?
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly what you were going to say, Rob, in terms of the plenary, but it's quite a good opportunity to recap the knowledge or kind of the key takeaways of the lesson. And also it can be, there's lots of different ways you can do a plenary. It doesn't necessarily have to be through questioning. Sometimes it could be a little exit ticket. Sometimes it could be something more creative. It can be a nice opportunity to, use lots of different techniques and try things out at the end.
Definitely. So a couple more questions I'll try and whiz through quickly. Rosie here asked about, are you likely to use the same lesson more than once? I think this is a great question because I know when I started teaching, I felt like that felt wrong. It felt like cheating. It's absolutely not. And you will definitely use the same lesson more than once. However, what I will say to you, and this is something you'll learn from Summer Institute and whilst you're starting to teach, the main skill of a teacher isn't to create a lesson from scratch and create all these resources from scratch. It's the skill to adapt resources that are already there. So if you have a lesson and you're teaching it, you've got 2 Year 10 classes, perhaps you're teaching a particular history lesson to, you're not going to teach the exact same history lesson to each class because they're going to be different abilities. They're going to need different ways of approaching that lesson. However, the core of the lesson will be the same. And then you're just going to adapt it slightly to each class. And then the following year, when you're teaching that topic again, you can return back to your resources, you can return back to your lesson plans and just look at them and think, right, do I need to adapt these because of the class I've got this year instead? question here around what sort of things work as a hook, other activities or a read listen kind of thing, they can absolutely vary. To be honest, when I was teaching, I used to love the hook part of the lesson. I used to love thinking of something to excite them and make them want to learn about what you're covering today. Again, teaching primary, maybe mine were a bit more creative, if you like. Like I remember the caretaker coming in and horrified, shouting at the class like, who's messed the hall up, and then as we all went into the hall and it's been trashed and we're trying to work out who messed up the hall, and it's sort of this whole topic around investigating and interviewing people and things like that. So little things like that were fantastic as a hook there. But then for a history lesson, it might be a particular big piece of a documentary that I've used to hook them into that, because it's someone else that can explain something perhaps a little bit better than I can, or in a slightly more interesting way. But yeah, hooks are definitely varied, and I'm sure we've all got some great examples of hooks that we've used throughout the time. Right, I'm very conscious of time. So I'm just having a quick look through any final questions here. Henrianna, quickly there, when you when you've said about could something such as students teaching one another what they've learned as a plenary, that's a great idea, great example of a plenary activity there. To tell your neighbour, sum up with your neighbour what you've learned. Exit tickets, yeah, we love an exit ticket. I did think halfway through the session we should have done exit tickets for you guys, as part of this session, but we won't. So thank you so much for all those questions. Apologies I wasn't able to get through all of them. As we said at the start, you've clearly got some fantastic questions, and fortunately Summer Institute is going to cover all of them for you, I'm sure. I'll hand back to Isabel.
Thank you, Rob, for running through those great answers to lots of really great questions. So thank you. Yeah, so just to wrap up, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to attend the session this evening. I'm aware that a lot of you are in the midst of exam season or very near to the end of exams, or have lots of other commitments. So we really appreciate you giving up your time this evening. As I've said, this is very much just an insight, just starting you off with a little bit of understanding of how you might approach lesson planning. But there is so much more to come at Summer Institute, and you've got a couple of things to kind of take away and have a go at, but also you'll get really into that in depth when you start Summer Institute in June. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Leo and to Rob as well for assisting with delivery this evening, and I hope you all have a fantastic time at Summer Institute and when you get to school in September.
Thanks, everyone.